What we're looking at here is the biosphere, right? All life on the planet. But we divide it up, or ecologists divide it up into these things called biomes. And what biomes are large geographic regions determined by climate, soil, and community. And that's what you want to remember, the three factors that determine or distinguish the different biomes from each other. The different biomes are different because they have a different climate, which actually produces a different soil conditions, which leads to the kind of community, the plants and animals that you'll find in that biome. So not only are these the three things that you want to remember that distinguish biomes from each other, but they are related to each other in the order they're listed here. The climate determines the soil, and the soil determines the community. So that's another idea that I want you to get from this. And I'm not going to go through all the biomes here on this slide, because there are other slides that go through each biome one at a time. But the one thing I do want you to notice here is how they're distributed on the planet. If you notice, there are bands that go across, the colored bands here, the same color at the same latitude. So the biomes are distributed by latitude. And you know that latitude determines climate. So because it determines climate, there are different climates at different latitudes. We find different biomes at different latitudes because the biomes are determined by climate, which determines soil, which determines the community. Of course, the colored bands here aren't perfectly striped across the planet because other factors like atmospheric and oceanic circulation determines climate also. As you know, or should have learned previously, climate is determined by the average annual temperature and the average annual precipitation in a region. And that's what we're looking at here on this graph. So we call this graph a climatograph because it displays the annual temperature and precipitation. Now, this happens to be New Orleans, and you know that New Orleans is all the way down on the southern coast, the Gulf Coast. And if we were to compare this climatograph to our own climatograph in Northeast Ohio, our climatograph is much more temperate, meaning that we would see much greater fluctuation in both the temperature and the precipitation because of the change of seasons. We live in a much more seasonal biome, the temperate deciduous forest. So, in general, we are cooler and drier. Like the climatograph on the previous slide, this graph also compares the mean annual temperature and the mean annual precipitation, or average, but not for one geographic region, for the whole Earth. And that means these areas represent the different biomes. So, for example, what's labeled here tropical evergreen forest is the tropical rainforest. That's that biome. So if we answer the question, which biome is opposite the tropical rainforest? So again, the tropical evergreen forest, tropical rainforest, same thing. Opposite of that, you might guess, like if I were to ask you that question, you were to answer quickly, you might say the desert. What's the opposite of the rainforest? The desert. But that's not true, because what we're looking for is the opposite of warm and wet. So that would be cool and dry, right? So that would be the tundra. So that's the idea that I want you to get from this, is how the biomes are distributed in terms of their climate. We also have this concept of microclimate, and we're talking about a much smaller geographic area than when we're discussing biomes or when we're defining biomes, even as small as inside a hollow log or under a rock. But if we look at this graph, we see that the city has a much higher temperature than the surrounding area. And that's the idea of a microclimate. The city has a microclimate. The city itself creates its own microclimate because it absorbs so much solar radiation that it causes the city to have a higher temperature than the surrounding area, which looks like would be more woodland. So again, these microclimates can be, micro means small, and these microclimates can be really small. So just a hollow area within a log, just under the shade of a tree or under a rock. Turn over a rock and you see all kinds of species that are living there that can't live out from under the rock. They have to live under that rock because that rock creates the microclimate that they require to live. So that's the idea of a microclimate. Another example would be like an oasis in a desert. That would be a microclimate. I put this slide together just to emphasize the relationship between climate, soil, and community in defining the different biomes. So each of these maps shows regional variations in climate and soil type and the community. So when you compare them, if you look closely, and you have to use a bit of imagination, but you can generally see that there is some similarity between these regions and how these regions are defined based on climate, soil, and community. So the climate, and that's because the climate in part determines the soil type, and the climate and soil together affect the community of organisms that live in any region. All right, on the next few slides, we're going to be running through the different major biomes. And we don't want to get into all the little nitty-gritty details, but I do want you to realize how they vary by climate, soil, and community. Especially, I'm going to spend some time just looking at some of the vocabulary that goes along with these. But we start with the tropical rainforest, which is probably the most biodiverse terrestrial biome. And there's a word right there, terrestrial, which means on land, right? So that's hot and wet, year-round, nutrient-poor soils, and that's something you might not think about, but because it's so wet, there's so much rain, it washes all the nutrients out of the soil. That's a process called leaching that produces relatively thin, nutrient-poor soil. So the nutrients are all locked up in the plants, and the plants then, when they die, they decompose and put the nutrients back into the soil, but that cycle is very fast so that the nutrients don't build up in the soil very much. So the dominant plants here are described as broad-leaved evergreens. That's opposed to what you usually think of when you think of an evergreen. You think of a pine tree, right? Like your Christmas tree. But these are broad-leaved, meaning that it's like the opposite of needles. A broadleaf is like a maple tree or an oak tree has broad leaves. Also, these special plants called bromeliads that can live on branches. So they don't even have to be on the ground in the soil. Kind of a soil builds up on a branch, and bromeliads are able to root into that soil and live just on a branch of a tree. Of course, we have the consumers, herbivores and carnivores, and they basically are listing the different species that are living in these biomes by those characteristics or by those categories, herbivores versus carnivores. And I'm going to leave you just to remind yourself of all the different species that live in these different biomes. You can read these for yourself, but what I want you to note here is just the range that they have listed here for the tropical rainforest. They everything from arthropods to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, like really wide diversity. So that's so that was the tropical rainforest. Now we're looking at the tropical dry forest, and as the name implies, how it differs from the rainforest is that it's much drier. But it's still warm year-round, and there are wet and dry seasons, so it's not always dry. There are wet seasons, but the soils are much richer than they are in the tropical rainforest because there's not so much rain to leach the nutrients away. However, there is erosion. There aren't as many plants rooted in the soil to keep the soil in place, and so when it does rain in the wet season, there's a lot of that soil washes away. So we've got deciduous trees, and this is the first we've seen this term. Deciduous means a deciduous tree would be a tree that loses its leaves. So, for example, where we live, the trees lose their leaves in the autumn, and that's why our biome is the temperate deciduous forest. Deciduous because the trees lose their leaves in the winter or in the fall. There needs to be drought-tolerant plants here. And again, that's the first we've seen this term. So drought-tolerant means that These are species that are able to survive without much water, to survive a drought, because there are dry seasons. And these kind of plants are like the plants you find in the desert, succulents. Cacti are succulents, and there are a variety of other plants that are succulents that store water. That's what a succulent is, a plant that is able to store water and survive drought. So here we have the tropical savanna and the temperate grassland on the same slide because they're both grasslands. And the tropical, referring to it's warm year-round, generally. Temperate, referring to there are seasons, right? So that's the biggest difference between the tropical savanna and the temperate grassland. There are frequent fires in both of them, and and also because of the seasonal rainfall, there have to be drought-tolerant species as well as fire-resistant species. So really the biggest difference between the tropical savanna and temperate grassland is that in the tropics it's warm year-round, and in the temperate regions or temperate latitudes there are seasonal changes. When you think of the wildlife in the tropical savanna, think Lion King, right? Because that's what's there. But grass is the basic food for the herbivores, or the primary consumers. In the temperate grassland, same thing, herbivores, and then there are carnivores like wolves, for example, that will be hunting the herbivores. It also mentions here compact soils for the tropical savanna and fertile soils for the temperate grassland. Fertile means there's a lot of nutrients. That's true also for the tropical savanna. They both have fertile soils. Compact just means it's really stomped down, not easy to dig up. The temperate deciduous forest is the biome that should be most familiar to you because, when you look at this image, it looks very familiar. That's the fall or autumn in the temperate deciduous biome. The trees are changing color and they're going to lose their leaves. That's deciduous, right? Broadleaf deciduous trees. But there are also conifers, so you'll notice that there's some green here mixed in with the colors, and that those are conifers that are evergreens. They're not going to lose their needles, at least not all at once. They do lose their needles, but just not all at once. But we're talking seasonal, right? We have seasons. Year-round precipitation. So it's relatively wet. There's water available all the time, and the soils are fertile. So there's not precipitation like in the tropical rainforest. It's going to leach away all the nutrients. We have just enough precipitation to supply water to plants for a great amount of growth, but not so much that it washes all the nutrients out of the soil. Then we have the temperate woodland and shrubland, and basically the difference is the amount of rainfall. That there are dry summers, much drier than the summers in the temperate deciduous forest. So there's not as much water to sustain really tall trees and really large, dense forests. And the soils tend to be more nutrient poor, and there are periodic fires. So what primarily grows there, instead of a forest of trees, there are grasses and shrubs, low growing kinds of plants. Annuals, meaning that they die off and they come back the next year, as opposed to perennials, and I forgot to mention that on the previous slide. Perennials are going to come back year-round, but annuals die off, and the only way they're going to come back the next year is if they're going to grow from a seed that was produced by reproduction the year before. The northwest coniferous forests are really along the Pacific coast, so they're close to the ocean, and that's what makes them mild. You'll notice the very first characteristics here, mild temperatures. So being close to the ocean means that the summers aren't going to be as hot and the winters aren't going to be as cold, and that's because of the property of water, that it has a high heat capacity. Abundant precipitation, though, and again, that has to do with being near the ocean. That's why it's well, yeah. And dry summers, rocky acidic soils. So really, the dominant vegetation are these very, very tall and straight conifers, needle leaf trees. Notice that the boreal forest, or taiga, is very high north in latitude, and that means it's going to be cold, right? So cold winters, short, mild summers, moderate precipitation. So generally, there's plenty of water for vegetative growth, for plants to grow. However, the soil is acidic and relatively nutrient poor, again, due to leaching. So even though it says moderate precipitation, it's still enough to leach the nutrients out of the soil, and it's also because the soil freezes seasonally. Needle-leaf coniferous trees, again, as opposed to broadleaf, but there are some broadleaf deciduous trees also, but the dominant trees are going to be needle-leaf trees. As we go even higher in latitude, as you can see on the map here, the little inset map, we get to the tundra, and the tundra is often completely covered with snow seasonally, but in this picture it's showing summer, but those summers are very short and soggy summers. Relatively low precipitation, so it's dry, like a desert, even though it's not, normally you think of a desert as hot, but here we have a cold desert. Permafrost, where the soil is frozen to a great depth. Only a few inches in the summer thaws for vegetative growth, for grasses to grow. And so large plants can't put down deep roots because they can't put roots through the permafrost, the permanently frozen soil, after just a few inches down. So you don't even see many shrubs and definitely not very big trees living in the tundra. So they're all ground-hugging plants. As we saw in that graph comparing all the biomes, like the chromatograph of all the biomes, we see the desert's the opposite of the tundra. I'm sorry. The tropical rainforest was the opposite of the tundra, not the desert. So the desert is warm like the tropical rainforest, but very low precipitation. So variable temperatures. At night it can get cold in the desert, and even some deserts are relatively cold even in the daytime. Rich in minerals, though, because there's not much rain to wash those minerals away, but poor in organic material. There's not a lot of plant material or living things to die and decompose and add themselves to the soil to add that organic material, because that's where the organic material comes from. And what we see growing here are a lot of succulents. In other words, plants that can store water for themselves for when it's not raining. The montane biome at the very top is polar, but not the entire montane biome. In other words, as you go from the bottom of a mountain to the top of a mountain, it's almost like going through all of the different biomes on the planet, almost. But there are mountains found on all continents, so we find montane biomes on all continents. And the conditions vary with elevation. In other words, the climate changes as you go from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain. So like at the bottom of the mountain, you may start out in grassland, and as you go up, you'll go through a woodland and then a forest. And then once you near the top where it gets colder, a tundra, and finally a polar region at the very top. Speaking of polar regions, at the poles, we have the Arctic and the Antarctic, cold year-round. The Arctic being warmer than the Antarctic. The Antarctic is much colder, and that's because the Arctic is not a continent. And there are also the warm water currents that are bringing warm water up from the equator go farther north than they do south into the Antarctic. The kinds of things that grow in the polar regions are just mosses and lichens, hardly even grasses or anything. And again, in the Arctic, there's not really any land. It's just ice on water. So the sea ice, the ice caps, in Greenland, even. So within the Arctic Circle, that latitude is what we're talking about. But Antarctica is completely covered with ice, 5 kilometers thick. That's a lot of ice. That's, as thick as the glaciers were that came down even into where we are right now in Ohio. There were glaciers that were that thick, and they still exist down in Antarctica. So when it comes to these biomes, I'm not going to ask you, nitty-gritty details about every single biome or anything on a test. What you need to have is just kind of a general idea of the characteristics of the different biomes, these different major biomes.